My name is Ryan, and I'm 22 years old. Growing up, I was always the golden child in my family. My parents, Noah and Linda, made it clear from an early age that I was the one with the brightest future. They encouraged me to dream big, and their biggest dream for me was to become a doctor. In their eyes, I wasn't just their youngest son. I was their legacy, the one who would carry the family name to greater heights. Then, there was my older brother David, who is 6 years older than me. David is the definition of hardworking. He took on part-time jobs while still in school, scraped together funds for community college, and never once asked for a handout. But no matter how much he achieved, it was never enough to earn the same admiration from our parents that I seemed to get effortlessly. Looking back, I can see how unfair that was, but at the time, I didn't question it. Why would I? I was their favorite. Everything they did reinforced that I deserved special treatment. If I needed money for a school project, they'd bend over backward to provide it. If David needed the same, he'd be told to figure it out himself. It became an unspoken rule in our household. Ryan comes first. When I graduated high school, my parents gifted me a brand new car, a gesture they called an investment in my future. I didn't think twice about how David felt seeing that, especially since he got a simple card and a $50 bill when he graduated. He had been working part-time jobs to pay for his education while I cruised around in my shiny new ride. At the time, I didn't understand what resentment might have been building in him. David never complained, though. He just quietly pushed through, working harder than anyone I knew. By the time he moved out, I barely noticed. His presence in the house had always been understated, like background noise to the more central drama of my parents doting on me. When David left, my parents turned their full attention to me. It felt natural. They would ask about my future, offering unsolicited advice and financial support to make sure I had every advantage. I wasn't ungrateful, but I did start to feel the weight of their expectations. They had built me up to be the centerpiece of their family narrative, and it was hard not to feel the pressure. At the same time, I enjoyed the comfort of knowing they'd always have my back. I leaned on that security, even as I let some of their support turn into dependency. David, on the other hand, was out there building a life for himself with no safety net. I admired his independence but couldn't imagine living without the constant reassurance our parents provided. It wasn't until David won the lottery that our family dynamic truly began to unravel. David had always been a realist. He worked a modest job, lived in a small apartment, and rarely indulged in luxuries. So, when he called to tell us he'd won $500,000 in the lottery, I was shocked. My parents were ecstatic. They called it a blessing, a gift from the universe. For the first time in years, they seemed genuinely excited about something David had achieved. But their excitement wasn't about celebrating David. It was about what the money could mean for the family. I didn't see it that way at first. I was happy for David and thought maybe this would bring him closer to the family again. When he visited for dinner that week, my parents didn't waste any time. Between bites of lasagna, my mom casually mentioned their mortgage and how the lottery win could help pay it off. My dad chimed in with a suggestion that the money could also fund my medical school tuition. David's face fell. He tried to laugh it off at first, saying he had plans for the money, but my parents didn't drop it. "This is a blessing for all of us," my mom said. "Ryan's dream of becoming a doctor can finally come true." I didn't realize it then, but that conversation marked the beginning of the divide between David and the rest of us. A few days later, David called a family meeting. I knew it wasn't going to be good. He looked serious, almost angry, as he sat us down in the living room. "I need to make something clear," he said. "This money is mine. I've worked hard my whole life with nothing handed to me. I finally have a chance to build something for myself, and I'm not going to let that slip away." The room fell silent. My parents exchanged looks, their disappointment palpable. My dad was the first to speak, his voice tight with frustration. "We're not asking for everything, David. We're asking you to think about your family. You've always been so selfish." I watched David's face harden. He didn't argue. He just stood up, said, "I've made my decision," and walked out of the house. That night, my mom cried in the kitchen, whispering about how David had betrayed the family. My dad paced the living room, muttering about ingratitude. For the first time, I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe we had asked too much of David. Maybe we hadn't appreciated him the way we should have. But that feeling was fleeting. The next morning, My mom looked at me with tear-streaked eyes and said, "We'll figure it out, Ryan. You're still our priority." And just like that, the pressure was back on me. The golden child, the one destined to save the family's reputation. At the time, I didn't realize how deeply those words would shape what came next. The weeks following David's declaration were tense. My parents couldn't stop talking about how ungrateful he was. Every family conversation turned into a rehashing of his refusal to do the right thing. My dad kept calling him selfish, and my mom alternated between anger and sorrow, lamenting how David had turned his back on us. At first, I didn't say much. I had grown up with the narrative that David was the less important child, the one who didn't contribute much to the family dynamic. Hearing my parents criticize him wasn't new, but this time, something felt different. His refusal had clearly hurt them, but more than that, it had disrupted the balance of power in our family. For the first time, David had stood up to them and won. Despite the tension, life went on. My parents refocused their energy on me, making sure I understood that they still had high hopes for my future. But without the financial safety net they had counted on from David, things started to feel more precarious. I noticed my mom cutting back on groceries, opting for cheaper brands. My dad stopped talking about the family vacations we used to plan, brushing off the topic when I brought it up. They didn't outright say it, but I knew they were struggling. It didn't help that David was thriving. We still followed him on social media, even though he rarely posted. When he did, it was about the boutique he had opened, a small clothing line for kids. I remember scrolling through the photos of the grand opening and feeling a pang of envy. He looked happy, surrounded by friends and customers who supported him. My parents, on the other hand, saw his success as a slap in the face. "Look at him," my mom said one evening, holding her phone up for me to see. "He's living it up while we're here struggling to keep the lights on. Maybe he'll come around," I said, though I didn't believe it. David had made his stance clear, but my parents weren't ready to give up. A month later, they called me into the living room for a family discussion. My dad was holding a notebook, the kind he used to track finances. My mom had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Ryan," my dad began, "we've been thinking about your future, about how to get you into medical school." I nodded cautiously, unsure where this was going. "We need to ask David for help again," my mom said, "but this time, we want you to be the one to talk to him." My stomach dropped. The idea of confronting David didn't sit well with me. He had always been the calm, collected one in the family, but I knew he had a breaking point. "What am I supposed to say?" I asked. "Tell him how important this is to you," my mom said, her voice trembling. "Make him understand that this isn't just about the money. It's about family." I hesitated. On one hand, I wanted to believe they were right, that David would see reason if I explained it from my perspective. On the other hand, I knew deep down that he wouldn't budge. He had worked hard for his independence, and he wasn't going to give it up just because we asked nicely. Still, I agreed. The next day, I texted David, asking if we could meet. He took a while to respond, but eventually he agreed. We met at a coffee shop near his boutique, a place he had probably chosen because it was neutral territory. When I walked in, he was already seated, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He looked up and gave me a small, polite smile, but there was an edge to his expression, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "What's up, Ryan?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit. I sat down and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," I began. "About med school." His expression didn't change, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I know Mom and Dad have already asked you for help," I continued, "but I wanted to explain why it means so much to me. This isn't just about me. It's about everything they've done for us. They've sacrificed so much, David. I don't think it's fair to just abandon them now." He didn't say anything at first. He just sipped his coffee and watched me, his face unreadable. Finally, he set the cup down and leaned forward. "Ryan," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I'm not abandoning anyone. I've given this family everything I could for years. I worked my ass off to make sure I didn't become a burden. And you know what I got in return? Nothing. No support, no recognition, just expectations." "That's not true," I protested. "They love you, David. They love the idea of me," he interrupted. "The responsible son, the one who picks up the slack, but they don't actually care about what I want or what I need. And you know what? That's fine. I've accepted it. but I'm not going to let them guilt me into giving up the one good thing I've built for myself." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, to defend our parents, but deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. "I'm sorry, Ryan," he said, softening his tone. "I know this isn't your fault, but I can't keep sacrificing myself for their dreams. It's time for them to figure things out on their own." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The conversation was over. When I got home and told my parents what had happened, they were furious. My mom cried, accusing David of tearing the family apart. My dad slammed his notebook shut and stormed out of the room. And me? I felt stuck. For the first time, I started to question everything. Our family dynamic, my role as the golden child, and whether I had been complicit in taking advantage of David's generosity. But those doubts didn't stop me from falling back into old habits. When the bills piled up and my parents started asking for help, I gave in. I maxed out my credit cards, borrowed from friends, and told myself it was just temporary. It wasn't long before the cracks in my own life started to show, and when they did, there was no one left to catch me. After the meeting with David, the tension in our family grew unbearable. My parents couldn't stop blaming him for our financial troubles, and I found myself caught in the crossfire. They expected me to pick up the slack, even as my own life started unraveling. At first, I managed to scrape by. I took on odd jobs to cover my expenses, but between paying off credit card bills and helping my parents, it became impossible to keep up. My dream of attending medical school started to feel like a distant fantasy, but instead of facing the reality of our situation, I made excuses. I told myself that David would eventually come around, that he would realize he couldn't just abandon us. In the meantime, I borrowed more money and made increasingly reckless decisions. The breaking point came one Friday night. A friend invited me to a party, and I went, desperate for a distraction from the stress at home. One drink turned into several, and before I knew it, I was flashing a credit card I couldn't afford to use, buying rounds for people I barely knew. It felt good, briefly. I could pretend, just for a little while, that everything was fine. But when the morning came, and I checked my bank account, the weight of my actions hit me like a freight train. I was drowning. I owed more money than I could possibly pay back, and I had no idea how to fix it. Worse, my parents had started asking me for more help, money for groceries, for repairs around the house, and for the bills they couldn't cover. Every time they asked, I felt a pang of resentment. They didn't seem to understand or care that I was struggling too. Things spiraled further when I got involved with a group of friends who had a knack for cutting corners. At first, it was small stuff, borrowing things without asking, using someone else's account for a streaming service. But it didn't take long before those small acts turned into bigger, riskier ones. One of them suggested using a stolen credit card to make a big purchase. "It's easy," he said. "You'll never get caught." I should have said no. Every instinct told me it was a bad idea, but I was desperate. So I went along with it, convincing myself it was just a one-time thing. Of course, it didn't stop there. Once I crossed that line, it became harder and harder to say no. And before I knew it, I was in way over my head. The day the police came to my apartment was surreal. I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 officers were standing there, serious expressions on their faces. They asked to come in, and my stomach dropped. They told me they had evidence tying me to a credit card fraud ring. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but the truth was, they had me dead to rights. I was arrested on the spot. Sitting in that cold, sterile holding cell, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. My parents couldn't afford to bail me out, and none of my so-called friends were answering my calls. The only person who could help me was David. When my mom came to visit me, she begged me to call him. "He's your brother," she said. "He won't let you stay here." I wasn't so sure. The last time we had spoken, I had accused him of being selfish, of abandoning us. I couldn't imagine him being eager to help me now, but I was desperate. So, my mom called him. David agreed to bail me out, but he made it clear this was a one-time deal. When I saw him at the bail office, he didn't say much. He signed the paperwork, handed over the money, and left without looking back. It stung, but I couldn't blame him. Back home, things were tense. My parents were grateful to have me out of jail, but they didn't understand the severity of the situation. They still clung to the idea that this was just a misunderstanding, that I could talk my way out of it. But I knew better. The charges were serious and the evidence against me was damning. I needed a lawyer, and I didn't have the money to pay for one. I texted David again, asking for help with the legal fees. His response was blunt. No. I was furious. How could he be so cold? I lashed out, telling him he was letting the family down, that he was abandoning me when I needed him most. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was my mess, and I had no right to expect him to fix it. My parents tried to pressure him too, but it was no use. He had made his decision, and he wasn't going to budge. When my case finally went to court, I felt like a deer in headlights. My public defender did their best, but it was clear the judge wasn't interested in leniency. I was sentenced to 3 years in prison for fraud. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a wave of emotions, anger, shame, and a deep, gnawing regret. I had made mistake after mistake, and now I was paying the price. But what hurt the most wasn't the sentence. It was knowing that I had burned the one bridge that could have saved me. David had tried to help me. In his own way, he had set boundaries, drawn a line in the sand, and refused to let me drag him down with me, and I had pushed him away. In the weeks that followed, I spent a lot of time reflecting on how I had ended up here. For the first time in my life, I was forced to confront the choices I had made and the people I had hurt along the way. My parents visited me often, their faces lined with worry and guilt. They kept telling me everything would be okay, that they were working on a plan to get me out early. But I knew better. I had to face the consequences of my actions. And for the first time, I realized that wasn't just about serving my sentence. It was about making things right. And I knew where I had to start. Prison wasn't what I expected, but it wasn't a place anyone could truly prepare for. The days blurred together in a gray monotony of routine. The worst part wasn't the confinement. It was the silence. No more excuses. No more distractions. For the first time, I was alone with my thoughts and forced to face the reality I had spent years avoiding. Every day, I thought about how I ended up there, tracing the path of decisions and mistakes that led me to rock bottom. The truth was glaring. I had been selfish, reckless, and blind to the damage I caused, not just to myself but to everyone around me, especially my brother David. It started with anger. I blamed him for not helping me when I needed him most. If he had just stepped up, I wouldn't be in this mess. That was the story I told myself at first, clinging to it like a life raft in a sea of guilt. But that story unraveled the more I thought about it. David had bailed me out when no one else would. He had said no to my demands not out of spite, but because he was protecting himself from my constant entitlement. He wasn't the problem. I was. I saw it clearly for the first time. I had spent my entire life expecting everyone, especially David, to clean up my messes. And when he refused, I lashed out, accusing him of being the selfish one when, in reality, I had been taking advantage of him for years. The turning point came during a quiet afternoon in the prison library. I had picked up a book on accountability, more out of boredom than genuine interest, but as I read, something clicked. The author talked about how our choices define us, how blaming others keeps us stuck in a cycle of failure and regret. It felt like a mirror being held up to my face, showing me the person I had become. I wasn't proud of that person. I started journaling, pouring out every thought and emotion I had kept bottled up for years. At first, it was a jumble of anger, frustration, and self-pity. But over time, the writing became a tool for clarity, a way to sort through the chaos in my mind. I wrote about my jealousy toward David, how it had festered since childhood, how it had shaped my actions without me even realizing it. David had always been the responsible one, the hardworking one. I envied his independence and the quiet strength he carried, even when life threw challenges his way. Deep down, I had always known he was stronger than me, and instead of learning from him, I resented him for it. That resentment had driven so many of my choices, from reckless spending to sabotage. And now, here I was, paying the price for those choices. Prison taught me that time is both a gift and a curse. It gave me the space to reflect, but it also forced me to confront the people I had hurt. I couldn't stop thinking about my parents, who had spent their lives enabling me, shielding me from the consequences I so desperately needed to face. And I couldn't stop thinking about David. I had burned every bridge with him. After everything I had done, I doubted he would ever forgive me, but I knew I had to try. Writing to David was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It wasn't just about apologizing, it was about being honest. For once in my life, I couldn't hide behind excuses or half-truths anymore. In the letter, I admitted everything. I told him about my jealousy, about how I had spent my entire life feeling inferior to him and trying to tear him down to make myself feel better. I confessed to sabotaging his business, to spreading lies about him to anyone who would listen. But more than anything, I told him I was sorry, not just for what I had done, but for who I had been. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't expect it. The damage I had caused was too great, and I knew that rebuilding trust, if it was even possible, would take time. But I needed him to know that I was taking responsibility for my actions, that I was trying to change. When I mailed the letter, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I didn't know if David would even read it, let alone respond. But sending it felt like a step forward, a small, shaky step, but a step nonetheless. Meanwhile, my parents were struggling. They visited me regularly, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. They had poured everything they had into trying to help me, maxing out credit cards and taking on debts they couldn't afford. I saw the toll it was taking on them, and for the first time, I felt a deep, aching guilt. My parents weren't perfect. They had enabled me in ways that hurt both of us, but they didn't deserve the burden I had placed on them. I started using my limited free time in prison to think about how I could make things right, not just with David, but with my parents too. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't happen overnight, but I was determined to try. One day, during a particularly quiet evening in my cell, I found myself thinking about something David had said to me years ago. "You can't keep running from your problems, Ryan. At some point, you have to face them." I had dismissed it at the time, brushing it off as one of his lectures, but now, those words echoed in my mind. He was right. For the first time, I stopped running. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into every self-improvement program I could find in prison. I attended therapy sessions, participated in group discussions, and even started volunteering in the prison library to help others with their legal cases. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. I wasn't just trying to pass the time. I was trying to become someone better, someone worthy of the forgiveness I so desperately wanted. As the months went by, I received no response from David. I told myself it was okay, that he had every right to ignore me, but a small part of me still hoped he would write back, that he would give me a chance to show him I was serious about changing. Until then, I would keep working on myself, not for David, not for my parents, but for me. Because for the first time in my life, I realized that real change had to start from within. Prison wasn't just a punishment. It was a crucible. The first few months were the hardest. The loss of freedom, the routines, and the stark realization of how much I had squandered all weighed on me. But it also gave me something I hadn't had in years: time to think. I spent countless nights lying awake, replaying every moment that led me here. The way I leaned on my parents, the bitterness I directed at David, and the entitlement that had consumed me. It was an ugly reflection, but it was mine, and I couldn't look away anymore. About 6 months into my sentence, I signed up for a personal development program. It wasn't much, a mix of therapy sessions and workshops, but it felt like a lifeline. For the first time, I was forced to unpack why I had made the choices I did. The therapy sessions were eye-opening. I talked about my childhood, about being the golden child, and how my parents' constant praise fed into a warped sense of entitlement. I confessed how I had resented David, envying his independence and his ability to make something of himself without our parents' approval. One session hit particularly hard. My therapist asked me if I thought I'd ever truly earned anything in my life. The answer, of course, was no. Every opportunity, every cushion from failure had come from someone else. And when that safety net was gone, I had no idea how to stand on my own. That realization shook me. Letters from my parents kept coming, though their tone began to shift. At first, they were full of apologies and promises to get me out early, but over time, their optimism faded. My mom admitted they were struggling financially. Between the legal fees and their own debts, they were barely holding on. It was painful to read. For all their faults, my parents had believed they were helping me by shielding me from responsibility. Now, they were paying for that mistake as much as I was. But there was one person I hadn't heard from: David. I debated writing to him for months. Every time I sat down to start, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. What could I even say? Sorry didn't feel like enough, not after everything I had done. But eventually, I realized that not writing was just another way of avoiding responsibility. If I was serious about changing, I had to face him, even if he didn't want to hear from me. So one evening, I sat in my cell and began to write. The words came slowly at first, stilted and awkward, but as I wrote, the dam broke. I told him about the envy I'd carried for years, how I had always felt like I was living in his shadow despite being the favorite. I admitted to sabotaging his business and lashing out when he refused to bail me out. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, I wrote, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell you the truth. It wasn't a perfect letter, but it was honest. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of relief. Weeks passed, and I didn't hear back. I told myself I hadn't written for a response, but deep down, I had hoped for some sign that he'd read it. When nothing came, I tried to let it go. Instead, I focused on rebuilding myself. I took up a job in the prison's workshop, repairing furniture and learning skills I'd never bothered with before. I found unexpected satisfaction in the work, in seeing something broken become whole again. It was a small thing, but it gave me hope. Then, one day, a letter arrived. It was from David. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, my hands trembling slightly. Inside was a short note, written in his familiar, neat handwriting. Ryan, I got your letter. It's going to take time to process everything you said. I won't lie. What you did hurt me deeply, and I'm not sure our relationship can ever go back to what it was. But I appreciate your honesty. I hope you're serious about changing, not for me or our parents, but for yourself. Take care, David. It wasn't the reconciliation I had secretly hoped for, but it was more than I deserved. As my release date approached, I started to think about what came next. I knew I couldn't go back to my old life, but starting fresh felt overwhelming. My parents wrote to say they had downsized, selling the house to pay off debts. They still believed I'd come back to live with them, but I knew that wasn't the right choice. Instead, I began exploring halfway houses and work programs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. When I finally walked out of the prison gates, the world felt bigger and brighter than I remembered. My parents were there to greet me, their faces a mix of relief and uncertainty. We hugged, but I kept some distance, both physically and emotionally. They wanted me to come home, but I told them I needed to figure things out on my own. It wasn't easy. For months, I juggled odd jobs, scraped together rent for a tiny room in a shared house, and tried to rebuild my life. But this time, I wasn't looking for handouts. One day, I mustered the courage to visit David's boutique. I didn't expect him to be there. I just wanted to see what he had built. The store was beautiful, full of bright, colorful designs that felt like an extension of his personality. It hit me then just how much I had underestimated him, how much I had taken for granted. As I turned to leave, the door behind the counter opened, and David walked out. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Looking back, I realize how much I had to lose before I could truly understand what mattered. My parents, David, even myself. I had let all of it slip through my fingers because I was too focused on what I thought I deserved rather than what I could earn. I'm still a work in progress, but for the first time, I feel like I'm moving in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, there's still a chance to make things right.